In a gleaming Chicago boardroom, a decorated Army veteran was about to face his most humiliating defeat. What started as a routine job interview took a shocking turn when corporate executives mocked his military service and PTSD. Devin Jacobs wasn't your typical unemployed candidate. For 20 years, he had led soldiers through Afghanistan's deadliest combat zones, known for turning chaos into victory under impossible odds. When executives launched personal attacks, he had no idea he was walking into a trap that would expose massive corporate corruption. Jacobs delivered a strategic counterattack that would transform a failing empire. What began as professional humiliation became corporate revolution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Devin Jacobs woke at 0530 hours to the phantom sound of incoming mortar. The nightmare clung to him like Chicago's winter fog, fragments of sand and blood. The weight of Sergeant Martinez's body armor under his hands, the metallic taste of fear that never quite left his mouth. He lay still for 3 minutes, using the breathing technique Dr. Patel had taught him. 4 counts in, hold for 4, out for 8. The imaginary explosions faded, replaced by the mundane sounds of his uptown neighbors beginning their day. His studio apartment reflected the contradiction of his existence: military precision fighting a losing battle against civilian chaos. His bed was made with hospital corners sharp enough to cut glass, but unpaid bills scattered across his desk like shrapnel. His dress uniform hung in the closet, ribbons and commendations gleaming, while rejection letters from corporate interviews filled a growing pile beside it. The mirror in his bathroom reflected what 2 years of civilian life had done to him. Still lean, still carrying himself with the bearing that 20 years of service had carved into his bones, but something in his eyes had dimmed. The confidence that had gotten his men through 3 tours in Afghanistan seemed to have evaporated the moment he'd traded his captain's bars for a business degree earned through night classes. His phone buzzed. Tommy Potts, right on schedule. You ready to knock these corporate types on their asses, Cap? Tommy's voice carried the same irreverent humor that had kept their unit sane during the worst firefights in Kandahar. It's just Devin now, Tommy. Has been for 2 years. Devin pulled on his one good interview suit, navy blue, purchased at a discount store but pressed to military standards. Bullshit. Once a captain, always a captain. You led us through hell over there. Some boardroom full of suit-wearing civilians should be a cakewalk. If only it were that simple. In Afghanistan, the rules were clear: protect your men, complete the mission, bring everyone home. In the corporate world, the rules seemed written in a language he'd never learned. Every interview felt like navigating a minefield blindfolded, where the wrong answer to "tell us about your greatest weakness" could detonate his chances without warning. This is different, Tommy. These people, they don't understand what we did over there. They see PTSD on my medical record and think I'm going to snap and start shooting up the office. Then you educate them. Show them what real leadership looks like. Devin checked his watch: 0800 hours. The Pinnacle Industries interview was at 1000. Plenty of time to review his notes, check traffic patterns, and arrive precisely 15 minutes early. Not the 30 minutes early that military punctuality demanded, but the civilian appropriate timing that Dr. Patel had coached him on. Pinnacle Industries, he said, more to himself than to Tommy. Strategic Operations Manager. 48. Applications, 3 callbacks. This is the only second interview. You got this, brother. Remember what you always told us. Adapt and overcome. The words came automatically, a mantra that had carried him through IED sweeps and ambush recoveries and the terrible weight of writing letters to parents whose sons weren't coming home. The memory hit him without warning. Martinez bleeding out in his arms, asking about his daughter's soccer game, the light fading from his eyes before the medevac could reach them. Devin's hands found the bathroom counter, knuckles white, breath. Coming in short bursts, 4 counts in, hold for 4. Out for 8. The panic attack lasted 90 seconds. He'd gotten good at timing them. By 0930, he was standing outside the Pinnacle Industries building in Chicago's financial district, studying the glass and steel monument to corporate success. 47 floors of gleaming ambition, filled with people who'd never had to make life or death decisions before their morning coffee. He observed the foot traffic employees moving with purpose, but not urgency. Smartphones glued to their ears, the kind of controlled chaos that suggested an organization running on momentum, rather than leadership. His tactical mind cataloged details automatically. Security cameras at every entrance, badge access systems, emergency exits clearly marked. Old habits. Dr. Patel said the hypervigilance would fade with time, but 2 years later, Devin still swept every room for threats that existed only in his memory. The lobby was all marble and indirect lighting, designed to impress rather than function. Devin approached the reception desk where a middle-aged, black woman with kind eyes and steel gray hair managed a complex phone system with the efficiency of a military communications specialist. Devin Jacobs for the 1,000 hours interview. He sighed, then caught himself. 10 o'clock interview. She looked up from her computer, and for a moment, her professional mask slipped. Her eyes held a recognition that had nothing to do with his appointment. Mr. Jacobs, Unsage Briggs, executive. Assistant to Mrs. Pinnacle. She handed him a visitor's badge, but her gaze lingered on his bearing, the way he held himself at attention without thinking about it. You're early. Punctuality is a sign of respect. Indeed it is. Something in her tone suggested she understood the difference between civilian early and military preparation. The 42nd floor. The panel will be with you shortly. As he waited for the elevator, Devin caught fragments of conversation from passing employees' budget concerns. Layoffs, rumors about the CEO's latest cost-cutting measures. The company felt like a unit with low morale, uncertain leadership, and no clear mission. Every organization had a rhythm, a sense of purpose that either drove people forward or ground them down. Pinnacle Industries felt like it was grinding. The elevator carried him upward through floors of corporate ambition, each ding marking another step away from the world where his skills had mattered, where his decisions had saved lives, where he'd known exactly who he was and what he was fighting for. In Afghanistan, failure meant people died. In the corporate world, failure meant sitting in his apartment at midnight, staring at his reflection in his laptop screen, wondering if he'd ever find the place where his experience meant something more than a liability to be managed. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, revealing a corridor lined with conference rooms and offices that could have been anywhere, in any company, in any city. Anonymous, safe, sterile. Devin stepped out, his dress shoes silent on the carpeted floor. His mind already shifting into interview mode, the careful translation of military experience into corporate buzzwords, the delicate balance between confidence and humility that seemed to be required in the civilian world. He didn't know that. In an office 3 floors above, Eleanor Pinnacle was already watching him through security monitors, recognizing something in his bearing that reminded her of another soldier from another war. He didn't know that this interview would become the moment when his old life finally collided with his new one, when the leadership skills he thought the civilian world didn't want would prove to be exactly what a failing company needed. All he knew was that conference room C was at the end of the hall, and that in 10 minutes, he would face another panel of strangers who would judge whether a decorated combat veteran deserved a chance to prove himself in a world that had never asked him to serve. Conference room C felt like a kill zone. Devin recognized the setup the moment he walked through the door. 3 interviewers, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, forcing him into the chair that put his back to the window. Basic intimidation tactics, though he doubted they knew that's what they were doing. In Kandahar, he would have repositioned immediately. Here, he took the offered seat and waited. Frank Morrison led the panel, a soft-featured man in his 50s, whose expensive suit couldn't quite hide the posture of someone who'd never carried real responsibility. To his left sat Jennifer Chang, VP of Human Resources according to her nameplate, her expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested she'd learned to navigate corporate politics through careful observation rather than authentic engagement. The third panelist, a younger man whose nameplate read David Kim, Operations, seemed more interested in his tablet than the interview. "Mr. Jacobs," Frank began, consulting a folder that Devin recognized as his application. "Impressive military record. 3 tours, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Very thorough." The pause before thorough carried weight. Devin had heard that tone before, the civilian equivalent of incoming artillery. "Thank you, sir. I believe my experience in strategic operations and personnel management translates well to corporate leadership challenges." Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's what we're here to determine, isn't it? Military experience is certainly unique, though I have to ask, how do you think someone accustomed to, shall we say, a more rigid command structure would adapt to the collaborative nature of modern business?" Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. Through his peripheral vision, Devin caught her glance toward Frank, not supportive, but not quite disapproving either. She was following a script she didn't entirely believe in. "In my experience, effective leadership adapts to the situation," Devin replied evenly. "Military operations require extensive collaboration between units, constant communication, and the ability to make rapid decisions with incomplete information. These skills—" "Yes, but surely you understand the difference," Frank interrupted, leaning forward with the confidence of someone who'd never had his assumptions challenged under fire. "In the military, you give orders and people follow them. In business, we need leaders who can think independently, who can navigate complex interpersonal dynamics without relying on rank and authority." The room went quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Chicago traffic 42 floors below. Devin felt his jaw tighten, not from anger, but from the familiar tension that preceded contact with hostile forces. David Kim looked up from his tablet, apparently drawn by the shift in atmosphere. "I mean, it's not like corporate strategy is the same as—" "What? Following GPS coordinates and calling in airstrikes?" Frank chuckled, and Jennifer's discomfort became more pronounced. "David raises a good point. We're talking about managing P&L responsibility, stakeholder relationships, market analysis. These aren't exactly skills you pick up in." "What was it, Afghanistan?" 3 tours in Afghanistan, yes, sir." Devin's voice remained level, but something in his tone made Frank's smile falter slightly. "Leading reconnaissance units, coordinating multi-agency operations, managing supply chains in hostile environments, and making strategic decisions under pressure with American lives at stake." "Well, sure, but that's very different from—" "Different how?" The question came out sharper than Devin intended. He caught himself, employed the breathing technique, but Frank had already scented blood in the water. "I think what my colleague is trying to say," Frank continued, his voice taking on a patronizing edge, "is that military experience, while admirable, tends to create a certain inflexibility, a tendency to see things in black and white when business requires more nuanced thinking." Jennifer Chang spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Perhaps we could discuss specific examples of leadership challenges Mr. Jacobs has faced." Frank ignored her. "I mean, let's be honest here. Military leadership is really about following orders, isn't it? Someone higher up makes the decisions, and you implement them. In corporate leadership, we need independent thinkers who can challenge assumptions and develop innovative solutions." The silence that followed felt like the moment before an IED detonated, that split second when training took over and time seemed to slow down. Devin could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the familiar hypervigilance of a combat zone engaging. But this wasn't Kandahar, and these weren't enemy combatants. These were civilians playing power games they didn't understand. David Kim, emboldened by Frank's example, decided to contribute. Plus, there's the whole PTSD thing to consider. I mean, we've all heard stories about veterans having episodes. Is that something we need to be concerned about? Frank actually laughed. David, you can't ask that directly. But I suppose we could phrase it as, how do you handle stress in a civilian environment? Are there any psychological concerns we should be mindful of? Someone asked. Jennifer Chang had gone visibly pale. Gentlemen, I really don't think. No, it's a valid question, Frank interrupted, clearly enjoying the moment. After all, we're talking about someone trained specifically to kill. Who's to say that kind of conditioning doesn't lead to problems in a team setting? The room fell into an uneasy silence. Outside the window, the Chicago River glinted as it cut between steel towers, carrying debris toward Lake Michigan. Devin's mind drifted to Martinez, to Corporal Jenkins, who died trying to save an Afghan elder from a suicide bomber, and to Staff Sergeant Williams, who took shrapnel shielding a group of children. When Devin spoke, his voice was soft but carried a weight that brought the room to a standstill. The soldiers I led were the best people I've ever known. They gave their lives to protect strangers, following commands from leaders they trusted would get them home. When I failed them, when I couldn't do that, I returned to a country that thanks us for our service while simultaneously wondering if we're too damaged to be useful. Frank's smug expression faltered. Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear beneath the table. Every day I wake up knowing men better than me didn't make it back. And every job interview, I sit across from people who think leading soldiers through wars somehow makes me unfit for an office environment. Devin rose from his chair slowly, his movements precise, controlled. You want to talk about stress management? About real leadership under fire? About making critical decisions with lives on the line? For the first time, Frank Morrison looked shaken. Let me tell you what I learned in the 15 minutes I'd been inside this building. The air in the room shifted like the tense quiet before a storm. Devin stood calm but commanding, carrying the same quiet authority that had steadied his unit in the middle of shellfire. Frank's confidence drained as Devin continued. Your lobby has a surveillance blind spot near the elevators. Anyone with basic recon skills could map out traffic and entry patterns in under an hour. Your staff talk about budget cuts and layoffs within earshot of guests, which points to either poor communication or a breakdown in leadership. Jennifer leaned in, her earlier discomfort now replaced by curiosity. David Kim had stopped looking at his screen entirely. Floors 38 to 41 are short on maintenance staff. The elevators haven't been serviced on schedule. Cleaning appears inconsistent, and there's dust buildup on critical safety gear. That means no recent inspections. Devin's tone was calm, clinical. These aren't minor inefficiencies. They're symptoms of an overstretched company trying to cut corners and creating the risk of systemic failure. Frank finally found his voice, though it came out shaky. I don't understand what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Morrison. I'm giving you a tactical read of your own environment. Devin gestured toward the cityscape beyond the window. You've got prime real estate and a brand that projects success. But the internal signs point toward decline. You're asking if I can handle corporate life, but the real question is whether your company knows the difference between leadership and management. Silence followed. Frank's face flushed red while David Kim watched, stunned, as if witnessing a slow-motion disaster. In the military, we called it force multiplication. Devin said, lowering himself back into his chair with steady purpose. Using limited resources to meet strategic goals by getting the best from every member of your team. Not through authority, but by building trust and inspiring performance beyond expectations. Jennifer finally spoke, carefully. "Could you give us an example?" "Operation Clearwater, 2019, Devin replied. "Our mission was to secure a key supply route that had been under threat from IEDs for 8 months. Previous commanders tried everything: more patrols, armored escorts, air cover, but nothing worked because they were treating the symptoms, not the cause." Frank shifted, visibly uneasy but unwilling to speak. The problem wasn't tactical, it was trust. The locals were feeding information to insurgents because they didn't believe we could protect them. We spent 2 weeks not on patrols, but on building relationships, understanding the economic pressures, the tribal dynamics, the fear that drove people to work with our enemies. Devin leaned forward slightly, his eyes moving between the three panelists. "We established microeconomic development projects, created communication channels that protected informants, and developed response protocols that demonstrated our commitment to their security. Within 6 weeks, IED attacks dropped by 90%. Not because we had better weapons or more soldiers, but because we addressed the human factors that enabled the problem." David Kim cleared his throat. "That's impressive, but how does that translate to corporate operations?" "Your company is facing the same challenge," Devin replied. "Based on what I observed today, you have a workforce that's lost confidence in leadership, operational inefficiencies that suggest poor resource allocation, and decision-making processes that prioritize short-term metrics over long-term sustainability." Frank Morrison's face had progressed from red to purple. "Now just a minute. The employees I overheard weren't complaining about workload or compensation," Devin continued, his voice cutting through Frank's protest with surgical precision. "They were expressing confusion about strategic direction and concern about whether leadership understands the challenges they're facing. That's not a personnel problem, it's a command failure." Jennifer Chang was no longer trying to hide her interest. "What would you recommend?" "The same approach we used in Clearwater. Gather intelligence on the actual problems rather than assuming you understand them. Build trust through transparent communication and consistent follow-through. Align resource allocation with strategic objectives instead of arbitrary budget targets." Devin stood again, this time with finality. "But first, you'd need leadership willing to acknowledge that current approaches aren't working. Leaders who understand that authority without competence is just institutionalized incompetence." Frank Morrison shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking. "Are you suggesting that we don't know how to run our own company?" "I'm observing that a company interviewing for strategic operations management, while its operational foundations are deteriorating, might benefit from someone who's actually managed complex operations under pressure." The room fell silent, except for Frank's labored breathing. David Kim looked like he wanted to disappear into his tablet. Jennifer Chang was studying Devin with the intensity of someone who'd just discovered something unexpected and valuable. "Your interview packet mentioned that Pinnacle Industries was founded on principles of innovation and integrity," Devin said, his voice returning to its earlier conversational tone. "But innovation requires risk assessment, and integrity demands honest evaluation of current performance. From what I observed today, your biggest risk isn't hiring someone with military experience. It's continuing to promote decision-makers who mistake activity for progress." Frank's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. Finally he managed, "This interview is over." "Yes, sir, it is." Devin moved toward the door with the same measured precision he'd maintained throughout the exchange. "Thank you for your time." As he reached for the door handle, Jennifer Chang spoke. "Mr. Jacobs?" He turned back. "Thank you for the assessment." Frank Morrison looked at her as if she'd committed treason. David Kim seemed torn between admiration and terror. But Jennifer Chang held Devin's gaze with something that looked like respect. "You're welcome, ma'am." Devin walked out of conference room C with the same bearing he'd carried into it, leaving behind 3 corporate executives who would spend the next hour trying to process what had just happened. He'd come seeking validation from people who didn't understand the value of what he offered. Instead, he demonstrated exactly why their approach to leadership was failing. What he didn't know was that 3 floors above, Eleanor Pinnacle had watched the entire exchange through security monitors, and that his strategic assessment of her company's problems had just confirmed suspicions she'd been harboring for months. The elevator doors closed behind him, carrying him down through 42 floors of corporate ambition toward the lobby where this confrontation had begun. But something had changed in that conference room, not just in how he saw himself, but in how at least one person saw him. For the first time in 2 years, Devin Jacobs felt like a leader again. 3 floors above the devastation in Conference Room C, Eleanor Pinnacle sat in her private office, watching security monitors with the focused intensity of a general studying battlefield reports. She'd been alerted to the unusual interview by Sage Briggs, who had an instinct for recognizing when something significant was happening in the building. She'd helped Eleanor manage for 30 years. "There's something different about this one," Sage had said, referring to the veteran scheduled for the morning's strategic operations manager interview. Something in how he carries himself. Eleanor understood that kind of recognition. She'd learned to read military bearing from 27 years of marriage to Colonel James Pinnacle, before the Viet Cong bullet that had made her a widow at 43. She'd built Pinnacle Industries from the ground up afterward, transforming her husband's modest engineering consulting firm into a manufacturing empire worth $800 million. But she'd built it on principles James had lived by: integrity, competence, and the understanding that real leadership meant serving something larger than yourself. Watching Devin Jacobs systematically dismantle Frank Morrison's assumptions, she felt a recognition that went beyond professional assessment. This was what authentic leadership looked like when it finally stopped apologizing for its own competence. "Jesus Christ," she murmured, watching Morrison's face turn purple as Devin delivered his clinical assessment of the company's operational failures. Every point the veteran made landed like a precision strike because it was absolutely accurate. Eleanor had been documenting the same problems for 18 months, watching Derek Ashworth's leadership slowly poison the organization she'd spent decades building. Her phone buzzed. Sage's voice came through the intercom with characteristic discretion. "Should I prepare a meeting request for Mr. Jacobs?" "Not yet," Eleanor replied, her eyes never leaving the monitor. "Let me see how this plays out." She'd been fighting a quiet war for control of her own company, ever since the board had pressured her to step back from daily operations 3 years ago. Derek Ashworth had seemed like a reasonable choice at the time. Harvard MBA, impressive. Resume, the kind of polished corporate presence that reassured shareholders. But competence and credentials weren't the same thing. As James had learned in Vietnam when West Point graduates with perfect tactical knowledge got their units killed, because they couldn't read the human factors that determine success or failure. Derek's quarterly reports painted pictures of efficiency and growth, but Eleanor's private observations told a different story. Employee turnover was at 18% and climbing. Safety incidents were up 30% despite being classified as minor in official reports. Customer satisfaction scores were declining even as profit margins improved, a combination that suggested short-term thinking at the expense of long-term sustainability. Most damning of all, Derek had been restructuring the company's financial reporting in ways that made Eleanor's forensic accountant suspicious. Nothing illegal yet, but enough creative interpretation of accounting standards to suggest someone was preparing to hide significant problems. On the monitor, Devin Jacobs was explaining force multiplication theory to 3 people who clearly had never considered that military experience might offer insights into corporate leadership. Eleanor found herself leaning forward, recognizing in his measured delivery the same analytical precision James had used when briefing superior officers who outranked him. but didn't understand the operational realities he faced. Force multiplication, she repeated softly. The concept was exactly what Pinnacle Industries needed, a leader who could maximize human potential instead of treating employees as replaceable resources. Derek's approach to management relied heavily on fear and competition, creating an environment where people focused more on protecting themselves than achieving shared objectives. Her laptop chimed with an incoming email. Derek Ashworth, requesting a meeting to discuss concerning developments. In the interview process, Eleanor almost smiled. Derek's network of informants throughout the company was impressive, but he'd never suspected that his most valuable intelligence source was sitting 3 floors below his office, observing everything through security systems he didn't know existed. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a file folder labeled Background Investigations Confidential. Inside were detailed reports on 36 potential candidates she'd been quietly researching, looking for someone who could help her reclaim her company without triggering the kind of boardroom war that would destroy everything she'd built. Devin Jacobs hadn't been on her list until this morning. His military record was impressive: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 3 combat tours with commendations for leadership under fire, but his civilian transition had been rough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Unemployed for 8 months after leaving the Army, struggling with PTSD according to his disability records. No significant corporate experience beyond a business degree earned through correspondence courses. On paper, he looked like exactly the kind of candidate Derek would dismiss immediately. In practice, watching him methodically expose the fundamental weaknesses in her company's leadership structure, he looked like the answer to problems she'd been trying to solve for years. Her office phone rang. Derek Ashworth's voice carried the strained patience of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "Eleanor, I think we need to discuss the interview that just concluded. Frank Morrison is quite upset about the candidates' behavior." "I'm sure he is," Eleanor replied mildly. "What specifically concerned him?" The veteran Jacobs apparently spent the interview criticizing our operational procedures and questioning our management approaches. Frank felt it was completely inappropriate. Eleanor smiled, though Derek couldn't see it. Did Mr. Jacobs' observations have merit? The pause on the other end of the line lasted 5 seconds too long. "Eleanor, we can't have candidates coming in here and attacking our leadership team. It sets a dangerous precedent." "I see. And what did Mr. Morrison recommend?" "Obviously, we'll be declining to move forward with this candidate. Frank felt his military background made him unsuitable for collaborative corporate leadership." Eleanor looked back at the monitor, where the conference room now sat empty except for Frank Morrison, Jennifer Chang, and David Kim engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Jennifer was gesturing emphatically while Frank sat with his arms crossed, his face still flushed with anger. "Derek, I'd like to review the interview myself before making any final decisions." Another pause. "That's really not necessary. Frank has excellent judgment about personnel matters, and I'm sure he does. But given the importance of this position, I think a second perspective would be valuable." She could hear Derek's teeth grinding through the phone. "Of course, whatever you think is best." After hanging up, Eleanor sat back in her leather chair and considered her options. Direct confrontation with Derek would trigger the board battle she'd been trying to avoid. But allowing him to continue degrading her company's leadership culture wasn't acceptable either. Through her window, she could see the Chicago River winding toward Lake Michigan, carrying the city's daily commerce toward distant shores. James had loved that view, had said it reminded him that everything they built was part of something larger than their own ambitions. Her secure phone, the one Derek didn't know about, buzzed with a text from her private investigator. The financial irregularities she'd suspected were worse than she'd thought. Derek hadn't just been manipulating quarterly reports. He'd been systematically redirecting funds through shell companies, preparing to loot the company's cash reserves before the board discovered his operational failures. She had maybe 60 days before Derek's house of cards collapsed and took Pinnacle Industries down with it. 60 days to find someone capable of exposing Derek's corruption while rebuilding the leadership culture he'd poisoned. On her desk, next to photos of James in his dress uniform, lay a folder containing Devin Jacobs' military service record. 3 tours in Afghanistan, multiple commendations for leadership under fire, wounded in action while saving his unit from an IED attack. Medically retired with PTSD, but his fitness reports consistently noted his ability to maintain operational effectiveness under extreme stress. Eleanor Pinnacle had built a manufacturing empire by recognizing potential where others saw problems. Looking at Devin Jacobs' record, she saw exactly what her company needed. Someone who understood that real leadership meant serving something larger than yourself, even when the cost was personal. Especially when the cost was personal. She picked up her secure phone and began composing a text message to a number Devin Jacobs didn't know he'd given her when he'd filled out his visitor's log downstairs. It was time to make contact. The text message arrived while Devin was walking north along the Chicago River, trying to process what had just happened in conference room. See, Mr. Jacobs, this is Eleanor Pinnacle. Your assessment of our operational challenges was remarkably perceptive. Would you be available to meet this evening? I believe we have much to discuss. E.P. Devin stopped walking, reading the message twice before the implications fully registered. Eleanor Pinnacle, founder of Pinnacle Industries, majority shareholder. The woman whose late husband's photograph hung in the lobby beside the company's mission statement about integrity and innovation. She'd been watching the interview. His phone buzzed again. If you're available, please meet me at the Chicago Vietnam Veterans Memorial at 1800 hours. Come alone. The location choice wasn't accidental. Any corporate executive wanting to discuss business would suggest a restaurant or office. Someone choosing a Veterans Memorial understood exactly what kind of conversation they were about to have. Devin spent the afternoon walking through Grant Park, trying to reconcile what had happened in that conference room with everything he'd believed about his place in the civilian world. For 2 years, he'd been translating his military experience into corporate buzzwords, minimizing his combat service to make civilian hiring managers comfortable. Today, for the first time, he'd stopped apologizing for who he was. The result had been spectacular professional suicide. By 1800 hours, the memorial was nearly empty. The black granite wall reflected the early evening sky, names of the fallen, etched in stone that would outlast the politics that had sent them to die in Southeast Asian jungles. Devin found Eleanor Pinnacle standing before panel 23E, her silver hair catching the last light of day. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'4", wearing a simple charcoal suit that managed to convey both wealth and practicality. But her bearing was unmistakable, the posture of someone accustomed to command, who'd learned to project authority without raising her voice. Colonel James Pinnacle, she said without turning around, her finger tracing a name carved into the granite. My husband. He was killed 3 weeks before the end of his tour. April 1971. Devin approached carefully, maintaining respectful distance. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. He was a lot like you, I think. Someone who understood that leadership meant serving something larger than yourself. She turned to face him, and her eyes held the kind of steady assessment that came from decades of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He would have recognized what you did in that conference room today. What I did was commit career suicide. Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. Mr. Jacobs, what you did was demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership my company desperately needs. The question is whether you're prepared to act on that demonstration. The conversation that followed lasted 90 minutes, conducted while walking slowly around the memorial as evening deepened into night. Eleanor's questions were precise, probing, designed to assess not just Devin's competence, but his character. She wanted to understand how he'd handled the worst moments of his military service, how he'd dealt with losing soldiers under his command, what he'd learned about leadership when the cost of failure was measured in human lives. In return, she painted a picture of Pinnacle Industries that bore no resemblance to the successful corporation portrayed in annual reports. Derek Ashworth's leadership had created a culture of fear and competition that was systematically destroying everything she'd spent 30 years building. Employee morale was collapsing, safety standards were being compromised for short-term profits, and financial irregularities suggested corruption that went to the very top of the organization. Derek represents everything that's wrong with modern corporate culture, Eleanor said as they paused beside the memorial's eternal flame. He's focused entirely on quarterly metrics and personal advancement, with no understanding that sustainable success requires building systems that serve purposes larger than individual profit. Why not remove him? You're the majority shareholder. Because Derek has cultivated relationships with board members who see him as the future of the company. A direct challenge would trigger a proxy fight that could destroy Pinnacle even if I won. She looked at Devin directly. I need someone capable of exposing Derek's failures while demonstrating what authentic leadership looks like. Someone who understands that real change happens from within. Devin understood immediately. You want me to go undercover? I want you to accept a position as special projects consultant, reporting directly to me. Officially, you'll be conducting operational assessments and recommending efficiency improvements. Unofficially, you'll be gathering evidence of Derek's mismanagement while building relationships with employees who remember what this company used to represent. The parallels to his military experience were obvious. Deep reconnaissance in hostile territory, building intelligence networks, preparing the battlefield for decisive action. The kind of mission that required patience, precision, and the ability to maintain cover while operating behind enemy lines. What makes you think I can succeed where others have failed? Eleanor gestured toward the names carved into the memorial wall. Because you understand sacrifice in ways that Derek and his allies never will. They see employees as resources to be exploited. You've led people who were willing to die for each other. That's the difference between management and leadership. As they walked back toward the memorial's entrance, Eleanor outlined the practical details. Devin would be hired as a consultant with broad access to company operations, supposedly conducting efficiency assessments, but actually documenting evidence of mismanagement and corruption. She would provide secure communication channels and intelligence support through her assistant, Sige Briggs, who had been quietly documenting Derek's failures for months. The compensation will be substantial, Eleanor concluded, naming a figure that was 3 times what Devin had been hoping to earn in the strategic operations manager position. But the real value is the opportunity to use your leadership skills in service of something that matters. Standing at the memorial's entrance, with the Chicago skyline glittering beyond the park, Devin felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the Army, a sense of mission that transcended personal advancement. Eleanor Pinnacle wasn't offering him a job. She was offering him a chance to serve again. Why me? He asked. You could hire corporate investigators, forensic accountants, people with experience in this kind of situation. Because corporate investigators don't understand the human factors that determine success or failure in complex organizations. And because Derek's corruption isn't just financial, it's cultural. He's created an environment where fear and self-interest override integrity and competence. Exposing that requires someone who's led people through situations where those values literally meant the difference between life and death. Eleanor extended her hand. Are you prepared to serve again, Captain Jacobs? The title hit him like a physical blow. For 2 years, he'd been trying to become someone else, to transform himself into the kind of person the civilian world would accept. Eleanor Pinnacle was asking him to be exactly who he'd always been. Devin shook her hand. "Yes, ma'am. When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning. Sage will have your credentials and access cards ready by 0800. Your first assignment is to conduct a comprehensive assessment of our manufacturing operations. Derek has been claiming they're operating at peak efficiency, but our safety incident reports suggest otherwise." As Eleanor walked toward a waiting car, she turned back one final time. "Mr. Jacobs, welcome back to service." Watching her disappear into the Chicago night, Devin felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would enter Pinnacle Industries not as a supplicant seeking validation, but as an operator with a mission. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, he had a purpose that mattered. The memorial's eternal flame flickered in the evening breeze, casting shifting shadows across the names of men who died serving something larger than themselves. Devin stood there for several minutes, feeling the presence of everyone who'd worn the uniform, everyone who'd understood that real leadership meant accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond your own survival. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Devin's first day as Special Projects Consultant began at 0730 hours in Sage Briggs' office, a modest space adjacent to Eleanor's executive suite that served as the nerve center for operations most of Pinnacle Industries didn't know existed. "Your credentials," Sage said, handing him a badge and folder with the efficiency of a seasoned operations specialist. "Access to all manufacturing floors, financial records through Level 7, and personnel files for anyone below executive rank. Officially, you're conducting efficiency assessments for Mrs. Pinnacle. Unofficially." She gestured toward a secure tablet loaded with encrypted communication software. "Everything goes through this. Derek's people monitor standard company communications." The tablet felt familiar in his hand's military-grade encryption, the kind of secure device he'd used for operational planning in Afghanistan. Eleanor Pinnacle had resources that went far beyond what most corporate executives could access. "What's my first target?" "Manufacturing floor C. Derek's been reporting productivity increases of 15% over the past 6 months, but our workers' compensation claims are up 30% in the same period." Sage's expression suggested she had personal feelings about those statistics. Hard to increase productivity when your workforce is getting injured at record rates. The elevator ride to floor C gave Devin time to review the production reports on his tablet. Derek's quarterly summaries painted a picture of streamlined operations and improved efficiency, but the underlying data told a different story: maintenance. Schedules had been cut, safety inspections reduced, and overtime hours had increased dramatically, all indicators of an operation running beyond sustainable capacity. Manufacturing floor C resembled a combat zone more than a modern production facility. The moment Devin stepped off the elevator, his tactical instincts engaged. Machinery running at unsafe speeds, workers moving with the careful tension of people operating in hazardous conditions, safety equipment that appeared functional from a distance, but showed signs of deferred maintenance up close. The noise level was excessive, forcing workers to communicate through hand signals that suggested they'd developed their own informal safety protocols to compensate for official procedures that no longer protected them. "You the new efficiency expert?" The voice belonged to Maria Santos, a floor supervisor whose nameplate indicated 15 years of service. Her tone carried the weary skepticism of someone who'd watched too many consultants promise improvements that never materialized. "Something like that," Devin replied. "Mind if I observe for a while? I'm trying to understand how operations actually work versus how they're supposed to work." Maria's expression shifted slightly, suspicion replaced by curiosity. "Most consultants want to see the dog and pony show. You want to see the real thing?" "I want to see what keeps your people safe and what puts them at risk." For the next 4 hours, Devin conducted the kind of detailed operational assessment he'd learned in the Army, where understanding ground truth meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. He observed workflow patterns, interviewed workers during breaks, and documented safety violations that ranged from minor procedural shortcuts to potentially fatal equipment malfunctions. The picture that emerged was precisely what Eleanor had suspected. Derek's efficiency improvements had been achieved by eliminating safety margins, deferring maintenance, and pushing equipment beyond design specifications. Short-term productivity gains were being purchased with long-term operational sustainability and worker safety. More troubling were the human factors. Workers described a culture where reporting safety concerns resulted in disciplinary action, where production quotas took precedence over proper procedures, and where middle management lived in constant fear of failing to meet impossible targets. The informal leadership structure that had developed to compensate for official failures reminded Devin of units he'd seen in Afghanistan, where poor command decisions forced soldiers to create their own survival protocols. "It wasn't always like this," Maria explained during a brief break, her voice barely audible over the machinery noise. "Used to be, safety was the first priority. Mrs. Pinnacle herself would come down here, talk to workers, make sure we had what we needed. But ever since Ashworth took over, she didn't need to finish." Devin had seen enough failed leadership in the military to recognize the pattern. When leaders prioritized metrics over mission, when fear replaced trust as the primary motivational tool, when short-term thinking overrode long-term sustainability, the result was always the same: good people trying to do impossible jobs with inadequate resources. His tablet chimed with a secure message from Eleanor. "How bad is it?" Devin's response was brief. "Worse than we thought. We'll have full report by 1800. The afternoon brought encounters with other key personnel throughout the building. Jennifer Chang, the HR VP who'd witnessed his interview demolition of Frank Morrison, approached him cautiously in the executive elevator. "Mr. Jacobs, I wanted to apologize for yesterday's interview. Frank's behavior was unprofessional." "No apology necessary, Ms. Chang. Sometimes difficult conversations reveal important truths." She studied him carefully. "What kind of truths?" "The kind that determine whether organizations succeed or fail when facing real challenges." The elevator reached her floor, but Jennifer hesitated before stepping off. "If you're conducting efficiency assessments, you should know that our employee satisfaction surveys have been concerning. Exit interviews suggest people are leaving not because of compensation, but because they've lost confidence in leadership." The information aligned perfectly with what Devin had observed on the manufacturing floor. Jennifer Chang was clearly struggling with her role in perpetuating a system she didn't believe in, another parallel to his military experience, where good officers sometimes found themselves implementing policies that contradicted their understanding of effective leadership. His next encounter was less friendly. Ashley Pinnacle Morrison intercepted him near the executive conference rooms, her expression hostile and suspicious. "You're the consultant my grandmother hired," she said, without preamble. "I want to know what you're really doing here." Ashley was young, probably late 20s, with the confident bearing of someone who'd never had to question her place in the world. But her eyes held intelligence and frustration in equal measure. She understood that something was wrong with the company, but lacked the experience to identify or address the problems. "I'm assessing operational efficiency and identifying areas for improvement," Devin replied neutrally. "Bullshit. Grandmother doesn't hire military consultants to conduct efficiency studies. She has corporate people for that. So what's your real mission?" The directness reminded him of young lieutenants who'd learned that survival in combat zones required cutting through official bullshit to understand actual threats. Ashley might be hostile, but she wasn't stupid. "Your grandmother is concerned about the company's long-term sustainability. I'm helping her understand whether current operational approaches support or undermine that goal, which means you're investigating Derek. Ashley's voice carried a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Good. Someone needs to figure out why a company my family built over 30 years is suddenly falling apart. Before Devin could respond, Ashley continued, "But if you think you're going to walk in here and take over everything my grandmother spent her life building, you're going to find out that some of us won't go quietly." The warning was clear, but Devin heard something else in her voice: fear. Ashley was terrified that she'd lose her inheritance, but she was more terrified that she'd lose the legacy her family had created. That suggested someone he could potentially work with once she understood his actual objectives. By 1700 hours, Devin had compiled a comprehensive assessment that documented systematic safety violations, financial irregularities, and leadership failures throughout Pinnacle Industries' operations. Derek Ashworth hadn't just been cutting corners, he'd been systematically dismantling the operational culture that had made the company successful, replacing competence-based decision-making with fear-based compliance. The secure tablet chimed with another message from Eleanor. "Report ready?" "Yes, ma'am. Recommend immediate meeting. My office, 1800 hours." As Devin prepared for his first formal briefing as Eleanor's intelligence asset, he felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility. Tomorrow, the real mission would begin: building the case that would expose Derek's corruption while demonstrating what authentic leadership could accomplish. But tonight, he had to convince Eleanor Pinnacle that her company could still be saved. The secure briefing room adjacent to Eleanor's office felt like a military command center, complete with encrypted communications equipment and multiple monitors displaying real-time operational data. Devin spread his assessment documents across the conference table while Eleanor and Sage reviewed the evidence with the focused intensity of generals planning a complex operation. "Safety violations on every manufacturing floor," Devin reported, his voice carrying the measured precision of a military briefing. "Equipment maintenance deferred beyond acceptable limits, worker injury rates up 30%, and informal leadership structures developing to compensate for official safety failures." Eleanor's expression grew grimmer with each revelation. "What about the financial irregularities?" "Derek's productivity improvements are smoke and mirrors. He's achieved short-term gains by eliminating safety margins and deferring capital investments. The company is essentially cannibalizing its future operational capacity to generate current quarter profits." Sage highlighted several documents on her tablet. "The workers' compensation claims alone are going to cost us $2.3 million this year. That's not factored into Derek's profit projections. Worse," Devin continued, "the culture he's created actively discourages people from reporting problems. Workers are so afraid of disciplinary action that they're developing their own safety protocols instead of using official channels. When that breaks down, and it will, the liability exposure will be catastrophic." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. "How long before this becomes visible to the board?" "Based on current trends, maybe 8 weeks. Before the injury rates trigger an OSHA investigation. 12 weeks before the maintenance deferrals cause a major equipment failure. The financial exposure is going to be unavoidable within the quarter." The room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. Eleanor had built Pinnacle Industries on the principle that sustainable success required investing in people and infrastructure, not exploiting them. Derek's approach represented everything she'd spent 30 years fighting against. "What do you recommend?" Before Devin could answer, Sage's secure tablet chimed with an urgent message. "Someone's requesting access to your floor," she reported. "Alexia Ryan, Chicago Tribune, says she has an appointment." Eleanor and Devin exchanged glances. "I didn't schedule any interviews," Eleanor said. "Neither did I," Sage replied. "But she's been investigating corporate financial irregularities for the past 6 months." Juan won 3 journalism awards for exposing corruption at mid-sized companies. Devin felt his tactical instincts engaging. Investigative journalist. Showing up the day after I start gathering evidence? That's not coincidence. Eleanor made a decision with characteristic speed. Bring her up. Let's find out what she knows. Alexia Ryan entered the briefing room like someone accustomed to walking into hostile territory. Mid-30s, sharp-eyed, carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone who'd learned to extract truth from people who specialized in concealing it. She assessed the room's occupants quickly, her gaze lingering on Devin's military bearing and the classified documents spread across the table. "Ms. Ryan," Eleanor said carefully, "what brings you to Pinnacle Industries?" "Financial. Irregularities in your quarterly reports," Alexia replied without preamble. "Revenue recognition patterns that don't match your operational capacity. Maintenance deferrals that suggest cash flow problems, and worker safety data that contradicts your efficiency claims." Devin studied her with professional interest. Either she was conducting independent parallel investigation, or someone was feeding her information that aligned perfectly with his own findings. Neither option was coincidental. "What's your source?" he asked. Alexia's eyes sharpened as she focused on him. "You're not corporate management." "Military background, probably intelligence." She paused, processing additional details. "Recently hired, conducting assessments that Derek Ashworth doesn't know about." Eleanor intervened before the conversation could become adversarial. "Ms. Ryan, perhaps we could discuss what you've discovered and why you believe it's relevant." For the next 40 minutes, Alexia outlined an investigation that had begun with anonymous tips about financial irregularities and expanded into a comprehensive analysis of Derek's management practices. Her documentation paralleled Devin's findings, almost perfectly: safety violations, maintenance deferrals, and accounting practices that prioritized appearance over substance. "Someone's been feeding you information," Devin observed. "Your data is too detailed and too current for independent investigation." Maybe Derek's failures are becoming obvious to anyone who knows how to analyze corporate operations. Alexia leaned forward slightly. "The question is whether you're part of the solution or part of the problem." Eleanor made another command decision. "Mr. Jacobs is helping me assess the extent of operational problems within my own company. Ms. Ryan is investigating whether those problems constitute criminal behavior. It seems our interests align." Alexia studied Eleanor's expression, clearly evaluating whether she was being offered genuine cooperation or elaborate misdirection. "You're willing to expose corruption in your own company?" "I'm willing to expose corruption that's destroying my company," Eleanor replied. "There's a difference." The alliance that emerged from that conversation was unconventional but strategically sound. Alexia would continue her external investigation while providing Devin access to financial analysis techniques that supplemented his operational assessment capabilities. In return, Eleanor would ensure Alexia had access to internal documentation that substantiated her reporting, provided it didn't compromise ongoing operations. 2 days later, Tommy Potts arrived in Chicago. Devin's former battle buddy appeared without warning at his apartment, carrying a duffel bag and the kind of grim expression that suggested he'd driven straight through from Kansas City. "Heard you finally found something worth doing," Tommy sighed, settling into Devin's kitchen with the casual familiarity of someone who'd shared foxholes and MREs for 3 combat tours. "Figured you might need backup. This isn't Afghanistan, Tommy. It's corporate politics. Same shit, different uniform." Tommy's scarred hands wrapped around a coffee mug as he studied his friend's improved posture and focused energy. "You look like you're back in the fight." "Good." Was starting to worry he'd forgotten how to be a soldier. Tommy's assessment of Devin's situation was characteristically blunt and accurate. "You're running deep reconnaissance in hostile territory, building intelligence networks, preparing for decisive action against an enemy who doesn't know you exist. Textbook special operations. Except the enemy carries briefcases instead of rifles. Bullets, bank accounts, makes no difference if they're trying to destroy something you're sworn to protect. Tommy leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. Question is, what do you need from me? The answer came 3 days later when Robert "Tank" Washington requested a private meeting. The former Marine contacted Devin through Sige, suggesting they meet at a veterans bar in Chinatown where the noise level would prevent electronic surveillance. Tank Washington turned out to be exactly what his nickname suggested. Massive man in his 70s whose bearing suggested someone accustomed to command authority through presence rather than rank. Heard you've been asking questions about our operational efficiency, Tank said, settling into a booth that creaked under his weight. Also heard you know how to analyze what those answers mean. Devin waited, recognizing the careful approach of someone who'd learned to evaluate potential allies before committing to dangerous conversations. Been on Pinnacle's board for 8 years, Tank continued. Joined because Eleanor Pinnacle reminded me of officers I served under in Vietnam, people who understood that leadership meant serving something larger than yourself. Been watching Derek Ashworth turn that company into everything we fought against. What do you mean? Culture based on fear instead of trust. Decisions driven by personal advancement instead of mission success. People treated as expendable resources instead of valuable assets. Tank's voice carried the disgust of someone who'd seen good organizations destroyed by poor leadership. Derek represents everything that's wrong with people who've never had to make decisions where failure costs lives. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours, during which Tank outlined his growing concerns about Derek's leadership and his willingness to support efforts to expose systematic mismanagement. As a board member, Tank had access to financial data and strategic planning documents that would prove invaluable for building a comprehensive case against Derek's regime. Why are you willing to help? Devin asked. Tank's answer was simple. Because Eleanor Pinnacle built something worth preserving, and Derek Ashworth is destroying it for personal profit. In my experience, when good people stay silent about corruption, evil wins by default. By the end of the week, Devin had assembled an unlikely alliance. Eleanor Pinnacle providing strategic direction and financial resources, Alexia Ryan conducting external investigation and documentation, Tommy Potts offering tactical support and security expertise, and Tank Washington supplying board-level intelligence and political influence. The operational plan was taking shape. Within 30 days, they would have sufficient evidence to expose Derek's corruption to the board and the media simultaneously, creating conditions where removal would be inevitable. But success required perfect coordination and absolute secrecy. As Devin reviewed the mission parameters with his new team, he felt the familiar weight of operational command. This wasn't Afghanistan, but the principles remained the same. Clear objectives, reliable intelligence, trusted allies, and the courage to act when decisive moment arrived. The battle for Pinnacle Industries was about to begin. The emergency board meeting was called for 0800 hours on a Friday morning, ostensibly to address urgent operational concerns that had emerged from recent assessments. Derek Ashworth had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing his defense, marshaling allies, and crafting narratives that would shift blame away from his leadership while portraying Devin's evidence as the misguided interpretations of an unstable outsider. What Derek didn't know was that Eleanor Pinnacle had been preparing for this confrontation for 18 months. The Pinnacle Industries boardroom occupied the entire 45th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of Chicago's financial district. The mahogany conference table could seat 24 people, though today only 12 board members were present, enough for a quorum, enough to make decisions that would determine the company's future. Derek arrived early, confident in his ability to control the meeting's narrative. His presentation materials were professionally prepared, his talking points rehearsed, his allies briefed on their supporting roles. He'd survived boardroom challenges before by demonstrating superior preparation and strategic thinking. Eleanor entered at precisely 0800, accompanied by Sides Briggs and a man Derek didn't recognize, tall, distinguished, carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Corporate attorney, Derek assumed, probably specialized in executive employment contracts. Ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor began without preamble, we're here to address systematic operational failures that threaten this company's survival. Mr. Ashworth has requested the opportunity to respond to recent assessments of his leadership. I believe we should hear those responses before making any decisions about our executive structure. Derek stood, activated his presentation display, and began the performance he'd been rehearsing since childhood, the confident corporate leader, demonstrating competence under pressure. His slides portrayed Pinnacle Industries as a success story, with productivity improvements, cost reductions, and profit margins that exceeded industry standards. Recent assessments by outside consultants have raised questions about our operational practices, Derek acknowledged, his tone suggesting regret rather than defensiveness. While I appreciate their concern for worker safety and long-term sustainability, I believe their recommendations fail to account for the competitive realities we face. For 20 minutes, Derek presented carefully curated data that portrayed his leadership as innovative, decisive, and results-oriented. He acknowledged some maintenance deferrals as strategic optimization of capital allocation and characterized safety incidents as acceptable risk levels within industry norms. His presentation was masterful in its manipulation of context and perspective. Then Eleanor Pinnacle stood up. Derek, thank you for that comprehensive summary of your management philosophy, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd built the company from nothing. Now I'd like the board to review some additional information that provides context for those accomplishments. The stranger Derek had assumed was a corporate attorney turned out to be FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb, Financial Crimes Division. His presence immediately shifted the room's atmosphere from corporate politics to criminal investigation. Over the past 6 months, we've been investigating financial irregularities at several mid-sized manufacturing companies, Agent Webb announced. Pinnacle Industries became part of that investigation when we discovered systematic manipulation of financial reports, illegal diversion of worker safety funds, and accounting practices designed to conceal operational failures. Derek's confident expression cracked as Webb outlined evidence that Eleanor's team had been quietly assembling for months. Bank records showing funds diverted from maintenance accounts to offshore shell companies. Safety inspection reports that had been falsified to conceal equipment failures. Worker injury data that had been systematically underreported to avoid regulatory attention. Mr. Ashworth, Webb continued, you're currently under federal investigation for embezzlement, securities fraud, and criminal negligence in workplace safety violations. The evidence includes financial records, recorded conversations, and testimony from multiple witnesses within your organization. The boardroom erupted in shocked murmurs as the implications became clear. Derek hadn't just been mismanaging the company, he'd been systematically looting it while creating conditions that endangered workers' lives. Eleanor activated her own presentation display, revealing the comprehensive investigation that Devin's operational assessment had helped complete. Photographs of safety violations, documented equipment failures, financial analysis showing the true cost of Derek's efficiency improvements, and projected liability exposures that would have bankrupted the company within months. Derek's leadership has created a situation where we face potential OSHA fines exceeding $15 million, worker injury lawsuits that could reach $50 million, and criminal liability that extends to every board member who continued supporting his policies after becoming aware of these violations. Ashley Pinnacle Morrison, who'd been silent throughout Derek's presentation, finally spoke. "How long have you known about this?" "I've been documenting irregularities for 18 months, Eleanor replied. "But I needed comprehensive evidence. Before making accusations that would destroy careers and potentially trigger the kind of legal battle that could have killed the company." Robert Washington leaned forward, his expression grim. "What's our exposure if we act immediately to address these problems?" Agent Webb answered. "Cooperation with the federal investigation, immediate implementation of safety corrections, and removal of leadership responsible for criminal activity would significantly reduce both criminal and civil liability." Continued. "Support for Mr. Ashworth's regime would make every board member potentially complicit in ongoing criminal enterprise." Derek made one final attempt to salvage his position. "This is a coordinated attack by people who've opposed my leadership from the beginning. Eleanor Pinnacle has been undermining my authority, and this consultant, this unstable veteran, has been conducting a vendetta against corporate success." The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. The polished corporate executive had been replaced by a cornered predator lashing out at anyone within reach. Eleanor's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Derek, the evidence speaks for itself. You've embezzled over $2 million, endangered workers' lives, and created financial liability that threatens this company's survival. The question isn't whether you'll be removed, it's whether you'll cooperate with the investigation or face the full consequences of federal prosecution." The vote was unanimous. Derek Ashworth was immediately terminated for cause, his access to company resources revoked, and his actions referred to federal prosecutors for criminal charges. Security escorted him from the building while he screamed threats about wrongful termination lawsuits that everyone knew would never survive legal scrutiny. In the sudden quiet that followed Derek's removal, Eleanor addressed the board with characteristic directness. "We have approximately 60 days to repair the operational damage Derek caused before our problems become visible to regulators, competitors, and the media. That requires leadership capable of managing complex crisis situations while rebuilding organizational culture." Robert Washington asked the question everyone was thinking. "Who do you recommend?" Eleanor's answer surprised no one who'd witnessed Devin's performance over the past month. "I recommend we offer the interim CEO position to the consultant who identified these problems and developed comprehensive solutions for addressing them. Captain Devin Jacobs has demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership this company needs." The board's discussion lasted 30 minutes, but the outcome was never in doubt. Devin's military experience, analytical capabilities, and demonstrated integrity made him the obvious choice for leading Pinnacle Industries through its crisis and recovery. When Sage escorted Devin into the boardroom to receive the board's offer, he looked like a soldier receiving orders for a mission that would determine not just his own future, but the survival of everyone counting on his leadership. "Mr. Jacobs," Eleanor said formally, "the board of directors would like to offer you the position of interim chief executive officer, with full authority to implement operational reforms and rebuild this company's leadership culture. Are you prepared to accept that responsibility?" Devin looked around the boardroom at faces that reflected hope, determination, and trust in his ability to succeed where Derek had failed. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, he was being asked to lead people through a crisis that mattered. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "I'm prepared to serve." The transformation was complete. The struggling veteran who'd been mocked and humiliated 6 weeks earlier was now responsible for saving the company worth $800 million and employing over 3,000 people. The real work was just beginning. 6 months after accepting the interim CEO position at Pinnacle Industries, Devin Jacobs stood before a gathering that would have been unimaginable during those dark days in his cramped Chicago apartment. The company's annual memorial service honoring Colonel James Pinnacle had been transformed from a perfunctory corporate ceremony into a celebration of values that connected military service to corporate leadership in ways that honored both traditions. The memorial garden on the building's rooftop had been Eleanor's idea, executed with the same attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of Pinnacle's transformation under Devin's leadership. Native prairie grasses swayed in the Lake Michigan breeze, while a simple granite memorial bore James, Pinnacle's name alongside the company's original mission statement: excellence through service, integrity through action, leadership through sacrifice. 300 employees filled the garden, representing every level of the organization from manufacturing floor workers to executive leadership. The diversity of faces reflected changes that went far beyond operational improvements. This was a company that had rediscovered its sense of purpose and community, under leadership that understood the difference between authority and respect. Devin approached the memorial podium with the same measured precision he'd carried through Afghanistan, but his bearing now reflected confidence earned through civilian success rather than military rank. The dress uniform had been replaced by a simple navy suit, but his posture still carried the unmistakable signature of someone who'd learned to lead through service rather than privilege. 6 months ago, this company was facing a crisis that threatened not just our financial survival, but our fundamental identity, he began, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd. We'd lost sight of the principles that Colonel Pinnacle and Mrs. Pinnacle built this organization on, the understanding that sustainable success requires leaders who serve something larger than their own advancement. The audience included faces that told the story of Pinnacle's transformation. Maria Santos, the manufacturing floor supervisor who'd first shown Devin the reality behind Derek's efficiency metrics, now served as director of operational safety, leading initiatives that had reduced workplace injuries by 70% while actually improving productivity. Her promotion represented more than individual advancement. It demonstrated that competence and integrity were once again the criteria for leadership advancement. Jennifer Chang sat in the front row, wearing the confident expression of someone who'd found her authentic voice in corporate leadership. Her promotion to Chief Ethics Officer had been controversial among some board members who questioned whether the company needed such a position, but Devin had insisted that cultural transformation required dedicated leadership focused on values rather than metrics. Under Jennifer's guidance, employee satisfaction surveys had reached all-time highs while turnover had dropped to industry-low levels. Colonel Pinnacle understood something that modern corporate culture often forgets, Devin continued, his gaze moving across faces that reflected engagement rather than the fearful compliance that had characterized Derek's regime. Leadership isn't about commanding obedience, it's about inspiring commitment. It's not about managing people, it's about developing their potential to serve missions that matter. Tommy Potts stood near the back of the gathering, his presence a reminder of the military brotherhood that had sustained Devin through his darkest civilian struggles. Tommy's security consulting firm now provided comprehensive safety assessments for Pinnacle's operations, but his real value was serving as Devin's connection to the military identity that remained central to his leadership philosophy. The transition from warrior to CEO had been successful precisely because Devin had never abandoned the values that made him an effective officer. Alexia Ryan occupied a seat in the media section, her recorder capturing quotes for the feature story that would run in the Chicago Tribune's Sunday business section. Her investigation into Derek's corruption had earned her a Pulitzer nomination, but more importantly, it had established her reputation as a journalist who understood the human factors that determined organizational success or failure. Her relationship with Devin had evolved from professional collaboration to personal partnership, built on shared commitment to transparency and integrity in leadership. The changes we've implemented over the past 6 months weren't just about correcting operational failures, Devin explained. referring to comprehensive reforms that had touched every aspect of Pinnacle's operations. They were about rebuilding a culture where people understand that their work contributes to something meaningful, where safety and quality take precedence over short-term profits, where leadership means accepting responsibility for outcomes rather than claiming credit for achievements. The financial results spoke for themselves. Despite the massive investments required to correct Derek's operational shortcuts, Pinnacle Industries had achieved record profitability while maintaining the highest safety standards in their industry. Worker productivity had increased 15%, but through improved training and equipment rather than the elimination of safety margins. Customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs as quality control systems focused on excellence rather than cost reduction. Most significantly, the company's reputation had been transformed from cautionary tale to industry model. Harvard Business School had requested permission to develop case studies on Pinnacle's leadership transition. The Department of Veterans Affairs had begun referring military retirees to Pinnacle's management training programs, recognizing the company's success in translating military leadership principles to corporate environments. Robert Tank Washington sat with other board members, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed the vindication of principles he'd spent decades defending. Tank's mentorship had been crucial during Devin's early months as CEO, helping him navigate board politics while maintaining focus on operational excellence. Their partnership represented the kind of intergenerational leadership transfer that sustained institutional values across decades of change. Colonel Pinnacle's service in Vietnam taught him that leadership under pressure reveals character rather than creating it. Devin said, his voice taking on the quiet intensity that commanded attention without demanding it. The leaders who succeed in crisis situations are those who've already developed the habits of integrity, competence, and service that enable them to make difficult decisions for the right reasons. Ashley Pinnacle Morrison listened from her position near the memorial, her expression reflecting the transformation from suspicious heir to committed partner in preserving her family's legacy. Her appointment as Vice President of Strategic Development had surprised industry observers who'd expected Devin to install his own team. But Ashley's Harvard MBA credentials combined with her deep understanding of company history made her invaluable for long-term planning. More importantly, her public support for Devin's leadership had helped legitimize changes that might otherwise have been seen as hostile takeover by military outsiders. The memorial service included recognition of employees who demonstrated exceptional commitment during the company's transformation, safety innovations that had emerged from manufacturing floor workers, process improvements developed by engineering teams empowered to prioritize quality over speed, customer service initiatives that reflected genuine pride in company mission rather than scripted corporate messaging. These achievements weren't accomplished through top-down management or authoritarian control. Devin emphasized, acknowledging applause for the recognized employees. They happened because we created conditions where people could contribute their best ideas and efforts towards shared objectives. That's what Colonel Pinnacle meant by leadership through service leaders exists to enable other people's success. Sage Briggs sat with Eleanor near the front of the gathering, both women reflecting the satisfaction of strategists who'd executed a complex operation with precision and patience. Sage's role had evolved from executive assistant to chief of staff, managing the information systems and communication networks that enabled Devin's leadership style. Her institutional knowledge and operational expertise had been crucial for implementing changes while maintaining continuity with company traditions. Eleanor Pinnacle herself represented the bridge between past and future that made Pinnacle's transformation possible. Her decision to remain as chairman of the board while delegating operational authority to Devin had provided stability during turbulent months of reform. But more importantly, her public confidence in military leadership principles had legitimized approaches that challenged conventional corporate wisdom. The memorial garden where we're gathered today represents our commitment to remembering that business success means nothing if it's not built on principles worth preserving. Devin continued, gesturing toward the prairie grasses that would bloom throughout Chicago's seasons. Colonel Pinnacle's sacrifice in Vietnam protected the freedom that enables us to build organizations based on voluntary cooperation rather than authoritarian control. Our responsibility is ensuring that his sacrifice continues to have meaning through the choices we make every day. As the formal ceremony concluded with the traditional moment of silence, Devin reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The struggling veteran who'd been mocked and humiliated in Conference Room C had discovered that civilian leadership required the same fundamental qualities as military command: the willingness to serve something larger than personal advancement, the courage to make difficult decisions based on principle rather than convenience, and the understanding that authentic authority came from competence and character rather than rank or title. The reception that followed the memorial service provided opportunities for informal conversations that revealed the depth of cultural change within Pinnacle Industries. Employees approached Devin not with the fearful deference that had characterized interactions with Derek, but with the comfortable respect accorded to leaders who'd earned their authority through demonstrated competence and genuine concern for their people's welfare. Dr. Sarah Patel, Devin's therapist, attended as his guest, representing the medical professionals who'd helped him navigate the transition from military to civilian identity. Her presence acknowledged that PTSD remained part of his experience, but no longer defined his limitations. The hypervigilance and tactical thinking that had once seemed like disabilities in corporate environments had been revealed as assets when properly channeled toward organizational protection and strategic planning. 6 months ago, you were convinced that your military experience was a liability in the civilian world, Dr. Patel observed during their conversation near the memorial stone. How do you see it now? I was trying to become someone else instead of figuring out how to be myself in a different environment, Devin replied, watching employees from different departments engaged in animated discussions about upcoming projects. Military leadership principles work in any organization that's committed to mission accomplishment and people development. The problem wasn't my background, it was finding an organization that understood the value of what I could offer. Tommy Potts joined their conversation, carrying the subtle pride of someone who'd watched his friend overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Cap, you remember what you told us after that firefight outside Kandahar? About how the best leaders are the ones who make everyone around them better. Devin smiled, recognizing the reference to a conversation that had taken place during one of their unit's most difficult periods. I remember you telling me that leadership isn't about being the toughest guy in the room. It's about making sure everyone else knows they can be tough when it matters. Same principle applies here, Tommy said, gesturing toward the gathering of employees who clearly felt empowered rather than controlled by their leadership. You didn't change who you are, you just found the right mission. As evening settled over Chicago's skyline, Devin found himself alone with Eleanor near the memorial stone, both of them reflecting on the transformation they'd accomplished together. The city lights stretched toward Lake Michigan, representing millions of people pursuing their own versions of the American dream that military service had been designed to protect. James would have been proud, Eleanor said quietly, her hand resting on the granite memorial that bore her husband's name. Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've accomplished it. With integrity, competence, and genuine concern for the people whose lives depend on your decisions. Ma'am, I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saw potential when everyone else saw problems. You gave me the chance to serve again when I'd stopped believing I had anything valuable to offer. Eleanor's smile reflected the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully completed a mission that had consumed years of planning and preparation. Captain Jacobs, you earned everything you've achieved through your own competence and character. I simply provided the opportunity for your qualities to become visible." As the memorial service concluded and employees began departing for their weekend plans, Devin remained in the garden for several minutes of private reflection. The transformation from struggling veteran to successful CEO had been possible only because he'd stopped trying to deny his military identity and started figuring out how to apply military values to civilian challenges. Pinnacle Industries would continue growing and evolving under his leadership, but the foundation had been established, an organizational culture based on service, integrity, and the understanding that authentic leadership meant enabling other people's success rather than commanding their obedience. Colonel James Pinnacle's sacrifice had meaning not just because it had protected American freedom, but because that freedom continued to enable organizations built on voluntary cooperation and shared commitment to missions larger than individual advancement. Looking out over Chicago's evening skyline, Devin understood that his own service had simply taken a different form. The mission remained the same, protecting and developing people who deserved leaders committed to their welfare and success. In Afghanistan, that had meant bringing soldiers home alive. In corporate America, it meant creating conditions where people could contribute their best efforts toward objectives that honored their dignity and potential. The weight of command felt familiar, but no longer burdensome. He'd found his place in the civilian world, not by abandoning his military identity, but by discovering how military principles could serve civilian purposes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, standing in a memorial garden dedicated to service and sacrifice, Captain Devin Jacobs understood that he was exactly where he belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.